Now, the subject that I've been given to speak on is the question of the New World Order and what it is. And I think the title is The New World Order, Seduction or Solution. And that is a very provocative address because the New World Order is hardly known amongst a whole lot of people. So broadly what I want to do is to divide what I've got to say into two parts. First of all, to try and give you some historical background on what the New World Order is and what is involved and how its overall structure has been developed over a considerable period of time. And then from there we're going to come back and we're going to have a look at its impact and its effect and what it offers to Australia. And by the time we've got through that, we should have provided, I believe, certainly enough material for you to make some sort of decision about what you see as the future of this country and what part you have to play in it and what this means for your children and for your grandchildren, because all the things that are happening at the moment are of incredible importance for the future of this country. Now, the New World Order has really only just appeared as far as the general public is concerned. Most people had never heard of it until we had a war in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein, and there were major speeches made by President Bush and also by the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, Bob Hawke, that the coalition of forces that had been built together to wage war over the future of Kuwait in the Middle East was part of a program for a New World Order. So if you ask the average person, what do you understand by the New World Order, they would say, presumably it means a coalition of military forces that comes together for a particular action at a particular time. Now, that is true. That is part of the New World Order program. I might just tell you that what happened in the Middle East was only part of a program which at the current time involves 24 United Nations peacekeeping activities somewhere or other in the world. There's a great debate going on about their involvement in the Balkans at the present time, and they're also involved in other parts of the world, whether it's Cambodia or whether it's in Africa or wherever it happens to be. The idea of a coalition of international forces gathered together under the United Nations flag is part of the idea of a New World Order. That, incidentally, was one of the most incredible wars probably ever fought, for the simple reason that it went for a very short period of time, 43 days from the start of hostilities to the end of hostilities. It involved on one side a casualty rate somewhere between 150 and 200, and on the other side, nobody quite knows, but upwards of 300,000. 300,000 on one side, something like 200 on the other. And over the period of that 43 days, the expenditure on the war was a little bit under $1 trillion. That is $830 billion, and if you want to work that out, I think it comes to $180 for every living person on Earth today, spent in 43 days over a war that still is not ended, and we may see the hostilities continue. But that part of the New World Order program really is only one facet of a very broad program that has been unfolding for a long period of time. The idea of this started right back in the middle of last century, 1848, which is 145 years ago, when a very small book appeared that certainly changed the whole course of human events, a little book called The Manifesto of the Communist Party, written by a man buried in London now in Highgate Cemetery, Karl Marx, which talked about a worldwide revolution, and it finished with the words that said, "The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." Well, the ideas expressed in that little book lay in gestation for the remainder of the 19th century and came together in 1917 in the middle of the first great catastrophe of this century, the First World War, when 1 year before the war ended, a cattle train moved through Germany containing revolutionaries who were unleashed into the Soviet Union and promoted the second overthrow that had taken place in that year. The October Revolution, under the guiding hand of a man called Lenin, established the first communist base anywhere in the world. And from there, that architect, and he was a genius, he might have been an evil genius, but he was a genius, the architect of the communist movement set his sights on the final goal, which he was quite clear ultimately was to be a world program. And broadly he spelled it out. He said, what we're going to do, having established our first base, is to divide our program ahead into two parts. The first part is going to be concerned with breaking down the opposition, what he called the imperialist powers or the capitalist nations, which at that time were right at their height. The British Empire was at its height. It spread halfway across the world, and he said we will unshake and unseat the whole of that empire, and then having done that, having broken up the structures of the capitalist world, we will then swing into the coalition movement that is necessary for some type of world order to emerge out of it. And the whole of the first part of that program started in 1917. Lenin only lived a short time after that revolution. He died in 1924, but he'd done all the planning work which was then carried on by men like Stalin. And in 1936, they had managed to establish not only their base in the Soviet Union, but they'd established a huge international movement that came together, known as the Communist International, or in short, the Comintern. It was known popularly as the Comintern. And the Comintern in 1936 established its program, which contained three major parts. And those three parts were: one, we aim ultimately to socialize the economies of all the nations of the world. Two, we aim to bring about regional blocks or unions of the various groupings of those socialized nations. And then third, we want to amalgamate all those regions into one final world order. Now, if there's any doubt that the world order that Lenin was talking about was the same as the New World Order that is being discussed today, you've got to continue to have a look at how the communist movement, before it finally collapsed, involved itself in the planning programs that were being arranged after the war that is culminating in the huge debate going on at the present time. So from that period on, that is the beginning of the 30s, right through the Second World War, the program of revolution continued. There were special revolutionary training schools set up. Leaders from all the third world nations went back to train there. Some of them ultimately became communist leaders. Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. Some of them left and ultimately changed their political views. One of the famous leaders who went through the communist training schools was Chiang Kai-shek, who ultimately became a Christian and ended up across that narrow strait dividing Taiwan from mainland China, confronting his former colleague in class, Mao Zedong. So it is a strange and incredible history, but by the end of the war, the first communist bloc that had been established in what was the Soviet Union had expanded enormously. It had taken the whole of Eastern Europe. And today here in Australia, you can meet many Australians who came from those areas who remember what happened. Czechoslovakians who saw their country engulfed in 1948 without firing a shot, white-anted from within, and suddenly the Czechoslovakians waking up and finding that the previous democratic system they had got had been transferred and changed into a totally centralized power structure that from there on completely eliminated all freedom. Or countries like Latvia or Lithuania, or the area that is now being the center of struggle in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, and the tremendous national fervor and ethnic feuds that are going on today, all of which really have their genesis in the history of this century. For example, Tito and what he did to both the Serbs and the Croats in that period really is being fought out today. So there is no such thing as an issue in 1992 that can be divorced from its roots or its origins back earlier in this century. But by 1952, it was generally felt by the communist movement that the first part of that struggle, the revolutionary side of it, was changing. Already the decision had been made in colonial powers to abandon their former colonies and to move out and to leave what used to be called newly emergent nations in Africa and Asia or Latin America, wherever it happened to be, which broadly today we often call the third world, nations which are struggling to establish reasonable economic systems. And therefore, a conference was held in Moscow at that time, 1952, which said the time has now come from changing, from the revolutionary period that we've gone through, we've got to change into this new idea of trying to amalgamate all the crumbling forces of the world into some sort of social order. It was a very, very interesting conference. They had delegates from all over the world. The leader of the communist delegation that came from Canada to the 1952 conference later ended up as the prime minister of his own country, Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Very few people know that he was a communist leading a communist delegation to the Soviet Union back in 1952. Ultimately, incidentally, involved in quite a number of revolutionary activities in Cuba and the whole of that area. And from there, the first international discussions began to take place on something called the New World Order. The New World Order. And by 1974, the United Nations, which had been formed right at the end of the war, became the focal point or the instrument through which it was possible to foresee this New World Order coming to exist. And by 1974, the Sixth Special Assembly of the Sixth Special Session of the General Assembly of the United Nations made a formal declaration for one part of the New World Order, which was the new international economic order. And broadly, the New World Order has got part of it devoted to economics, part of it devoted to what you could call the social norms and rules of the new world that they're trying to shape, and part of it is to deal with the military side or the policing side of it, which is the bit that we saw in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein. And it was in 1974 that the United Nations made that declaration. The United Nations itself has got an interesting history. It is viewed quite often from two totally different perspectives. There is one quite legitimate point of view that what is needed is a forum for all the nations of the world to meet, to iron out their differences, and to see whether negotiation is a better way of solving world problems than fighting each other. Quite obviously, if that is possible, it's the way to go. There is another quite different view that sees the United Nations as an embryonic power mechanism which supersedes nations and which ultimately accumulates the decision-making process for the world that previously used to be the prerogative of governments like the British government or the Australian government or the New Zealand government or Europe, America, or whatever it happens to be. The Soviet Union, which was heavily involved in the creation of the United Nations, always saw that organization as being a body through which they could project the world order program. If you go back and look at some of the history of the United Nations, its charter was largely written by a man called Andrei Gromyko, who I suppose would be the longest-serving foreign minister anywhere in the world. He was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union right from that period until the late 80s, when he was finally retired by Gorbachev. And there was a tremendous pressure from the Soviet Union to ensure that the headquarters of the United Nations should be based in the New World or in America. There was a great debate about where it was going to be. The United Nations now has a number of divisions, Geneva and Paris, of course, where UNESCO is based, and also New York, but the main starting point was New York, largely at the insistence of the Soviet Union, because they saw this as a bit of neutral territory which could be part of the ongoing program to penetrate what was previously the capitalist world. Very interesting lot of history that most people know very little about. So if you can get the picture of what happened, the communist world went through this revolution, the revolutionary period of breaking up the capitalist world, and then having broken its basic foundations, changed course to bring all nations, perceiving the United Nations to be the body to do this, into some type of coalition which ultimately would become the focal point of a new world order which they had always seen as the legitimate goal for the communist movement. Now, please don't misunderstand me by assuming that I am trying to say that the New World Order is simply a communist movement. It is not. There was a tremendous involvement from a whole lot of other bodies in the Western world which saw the same idea in their own garb. There were people who believe in a New World Order that has a capitalist form. There are people who believe in a New World Order that has a religious form. So everybody who pushes towards the New World Order idea tends to see the final outcome in terms which are acceptable to them. That is one of the difficulties. That if ever we got a New World Order, there would immediately be tremendous conflict as to what shape it should be, what values it should reflect. So that was the situation back in, let's say, as we moved into the 60s. One of the most interesting things that has come to light recently was that in 1961, we had a top defector from the Soviet bloc who had been involved right in the decision-making process from the end of the war up to the period that he defected. A man by the name of Anatoly Golitsyn, hardly known. But in 1985, he wrote and published a book which is probably one of the most prophetic books and the least read of this period in history. It was a book called New Lies for Old. And what he broadly described was the planning that had gone on in the Soviet Union between 1952 and 1961 about a period coming towards the end of the 70s or even in the mid-80s when they would begin to woo the West in the final move for a new world order. And he said, what we are going to have to do is to change the perception of the Western world towards its former communist enemy. And in order to do this, the whole image will be changed. We will have a period of enormous propaganda. We will have a peace initiative. We will bring down the barriers that previously separated us from the capitalist world. We may even dismantle the Berlin Wall. We will woo the West with talk of peace and friendship and relaxation. And this was written in 1985, which was about 12 months before Gorbachev appeared at the head of the Soviet Union. Very revealing. So in 1985, all of a sudden, a new leader appeared in the Soviet bloc who told the Western world, yes, I am a communist. I've always been a communist. But I'm a different communist. I'm a nice one. What we're going to do from here on is we're going to break the whole Cold War psychology down. I'm going to relax the rigidity of the communist power mechanism. We're going to have freedom of speech. We're going to have freedom of movement. We're going to allow differing views. And this was taken up by the West, which itself was exhausted as a result of this long, protracted period of the Cold War. Thank goodness communism is changing. In 1986, the Soviet ambassador here in Australia placed full-page advertisements, which very few people read, in the papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian, which talked about the New World Order that Gorbachev was wanting to bring in. We want to be friends. We want international cooperation with regard to economics. We want a change in the Cold War, and the West wooed and accepted that message with alacrity. And so Gorbachev then left and went to New York, America, went through Britain, and was feted. It was one of the most incredible propaganda exercises probably ever seen. I read a report of how the visit of Gorbachev to the United States of America was set up. 2 Aeroflot jumbo jets full of Soviet personnel were flown into New York to set up his program. The theme of the program was simply human interest. There were to be no interviews with Gorbachev on international politics. It was all human interest. His wife went along with him, and for day after day after day after day, the interviews were simply on the grandchildren and the fashions that they wore in the Soviet Union and the type of lipstick that Reza Gorbachev bought in Russia and how she was shopping in the West, and how they had got married and how they had met and how they'd gone through college together. And it was absorbing stuff to a Western world that knew very little about what was happening behind the Iron Curtain at that time. And at the end of that program, there was an opinion poll run in America which showed that the Gorbachevs were more popular in the United States than their own president at the time. Now that is brilliant propaganda, to be able to achieve that. He was painted in Time magazine on the front cover as Man of the Decade, and was finally given the Nobel Prize for Peace by the United Nations. Now this culminated in 1990 of August. And you could really say that this program that was set in existence by Lenin, and which had fought its way right through the Depression and right through the Second World War and right through that subsequent war period, culminated in a strange conflict, not only between 2 systems, but between 2 individuals. Perhaps I can just show you the validity of this by giving you the background to this little book which was given to me by a trade unionist in New Zealand when I was lecturing across there in 1979. The book was being used as a major study source for all the trade union branches in New Zealand at the time, and I subsequently discovered it was being used here in Australia, particularly in what is broadly called the left wing. It was written by a top economist by the name of Ernest Dubminski, who was trained in the Soviet Union but who was working in the United Nations. He had a job in a division of the United Nations called UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He was part of a team of 400 Soviet officials working in that department. And the little book that he wrote in 1978 and printed in the Novosti Press publishing house in Moscow was the Soviet evaluation of the New World Order, which the United Nations had declared to be the program in 1974. And I thought when I was first given this book, well, the communists would be right against anything that came out of the United Nations, because they would perceive this to be a program which is furthering the capitalist cause. And I was astounded to find that when I opened this book and started reading it, it was quite specific. Mr. Ernest Dubminski, writing in 1978, said the agenda for the New World Order was first put on the drawing board by Lenin back in 1920. If we can persuade the nations of the Western world to release their national decision-making mechanisms and to transfer them across into international organizations, this will ultimately provide us with exactly what Lenin was talking about, the means to bring in a new world order, which is the ultimate in centralized power. So here was a Soviet evaluation of what was originally in the West claimed to be a Western program, the New World Order, that said this is exactly what we've always wanted, and it's exactly what Lenin was talking about back in 1920. And Gorbachev was the man who was picked to present the new image of communism to the West in order to provide the base where the whole Soviet bloc could be brought into the new world order that was being prepared. And he was undone by one lonely individual living in the United States, whose name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he probably, more than anybody else, has shaped what is happening in the Soviet Union today. Solzhenitsyn was a man who was born at the peak of that Stalinist period. He was brought up through communist training schools. He was taught to spurn any idea of a creator or a god. He was absolutely convinced that dialectical materialism and scientific socialism was the way the world would ultimately evolve to some shining destiny. He moved into the army and became an officer. But then he began to come face to face both with questions relating to freedom and questions relating to the spiritual side of man. And he began to speak out on his disagreement, his growing disagreement with the establishment inside the communist bloc. And the price for doing that was to be isolated or tortured or imprisoned, and he ended up doing 8.5 years in a slave labor camp in this new... This was going on, the latter part of Solzhenitsyn's period, at the time when Gorbachev was preparing to come to power and bring the Soviet bloc into the New World Order. In the 8.5 years that he was in the slave labor camp, he finally became a Christian and has written extensively of his experiences during that time. While he was in the same slave labor camp, he wrote the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago without a pencil and paper. He's recorded how he did it in one of his most recent works called The Oak and the Calf, and the way he did it was with a box of matches. He had one box of matches in his prison cell which he used to break into different shapes, and every time he could produce a different shape with these matches, it reminded him of a paragraph or a particular historical incident or a chapter that he'd written in his mind, and he came out of that environment finally with nothing but the matches and wrote that book in an incredibly short period of time simply by looking at the matches to remind him how he'd done it. And they didn't quite know what to do with Solzhenitsyn, whose literature was so profound and so majestic that it was not only moving throughout the Soviet Union, but was moving out into the Western world. They gave him the Nobel Prize for Literature while he was still locked in the Soviet Union. If they killed him, they would turn him into a martyr. And so they decided in the end to throw Solzhenitsyn out into the Western world, where he might be a sensation on media for a short while and then would sink into obscurity. So out came from the Soviet Union this lonely exile, who then began to speak to the West. And the message he brought from the Soviet Union is that you are going to lose this war because you've forgotten God. That was the theme that he produced everywhere. You've forgotten your spiritual value. You've forgotten the enormous heritage that you've got. And you might have to rediscover those things through going through the process of misery that we've gone through inside the Soviet bloc. And right at the end of this period, in 1989, Solzhenitsyn wrote a book which was really a letter back to the people of the Soviet Union. He wrote that letter just as Gorbachev was preparing to go to the Western world. 16,000 words, which has now been published in the West, but a World Central Bank, the phase-in of a new world money system to replace the existing currencies of the present under this World Central Bank. The third part of the program is something called the IPC, the Integrated Program for Commodities, under which the control of the production and distribution of the major foodstuffs, fibers, and minerals of the world would shift out of national control into the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which is a big body in the UN. And by the time you've gone through all that, the decision-making process for economics would move into the United Nations. The second part deals with the social order. It is the new value systems whereby men and women shall live in the world of the 21st century. And these are now being transposed out of the United Nations into every country that will accept them or endorse them or ratify them in the form of treaties and conventions. We have hundreds of them now into Australia. They always come out sounding absolutely beautiful. The United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination on the grounds of sex or race or marital status or religion. People say, what's wrong with that? Sounds perfectly logical to me. Who wants to discriminate anyhow? Forgetting that the original definition of discriminate was to choose. Why should anybody want to discriminate against women or men or people of another color or people who have a different faith system? And the fair-go reaction of the Australian is, that sounds reasonable to me. We're a reasonable people. So they ratify that convention, which comes in and is translated into law, and by the time it begins to work, it produces the exact opposite of what you thought it meant. It is now illegal to go to your own local newspaper and place a little advertisement in the classified section saying, I would like a married couple to come and work on my little farm or in my business. Because the word married is a form of discrimination against unmarried people. Is that what you thought it meant when you first heard it? The elimination, or let's say, the Convention on the Establishment of the Rights of the Child. Doesn't that sound terrific? We are right against any form of the exploitation or abuse of children. Why not have an international convention on the rights of the child? But by the time it becomes law, you discover that the rights of the child encompass the elimination of the rights of parents. In fact, there is a clause in that convention which says, parental discipline is a form of discrimination against children. Is that what you thought it meant? Now, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to tell you is that there is gradually being introduced into every nation a new value system whose origins are a new religion which is replacing the old one. And the new religion is the religion of humanism. Humanism has been cited as a formal religion by the United States Supreme Court because it has a belief system, a value system, a manifesto, which is only another word for a gospel. It has its own preachers. It has its own collections, its own churches and organizations. It is at war with any idea of a supernatural God, which it spurns as being a form of superstition. And we are caught in the middle here in Australia as a nation moving out of its traditional Christian value system, even though we might not be Christian believers in many cases. The values have their origin in a Christian heritage that goes right back 2,000 years, caught in the middle in a situation where the majority now have no values, have not been taught any values, where the educational system quite deliberately says we are secular, we're not in the value teaching business, providing a fertile ground for the replacement of the old with the new that is to come in. And the tragedy is that those who hold still the traditional value system of the Christian faith do not even know that war has been declared upon them, and are certainly not out in the battlefield. The reason that the third world is collapsing in this debt is because you have got too much of the cake. You're too powerful, you produce too much. Therefore, we are going to ask nations like Australia and New Zealand to quite deliberately wind down their productive systems. Stop producing so much. Allow your industries to be transferred across into third world nations so that they can begin to produce what you used to produce, and then open up your markets under a general world agreement on what is today called the level playing field, the elimination of all protection, and begin to buy back into your countries what you used to make yourself. My own opinion is it was crazy, but Australia voted for that program. And then subsequently, under Andrew Peacock, we began to implement that. The people who made the decision in Peru had no business to make it. What should have happened, I believe, was that they would have said at the conference, we cannot make this decision without consulting the Australian people. And they would have come back to us and said, we now have a proposition that we close down a lot of Australian industries, which means that you're going to lose jobs, and we might even get into debt. But this is one way of helping the third world, and we will allow those industries to be shifted into the third world countries, and then we will begin to buy back a lot of what we used to make ourselves. But you're the ones who are going to have to make the sacrifice. You're the ones who will have unemployment. You're the ones who will lose your farm. Are you prepared to do that to help the third world? And we could then have had a national debate, and they could have gone back to represent the decision that we've made and said in that conference, yes, the Australian people agree. Instead of which it was done at a level which did not only involve no participation, but not even the knowledge of the ordinary people who are now losing their jobs and their industries here in this country. The Lima Declaration became the formal trade policy. There is a lot of attempts to deny that this happened, but the evidence is there. And from 1975, which is when we agreed to participate, we have now closed down 50% of the manufacturing industries of Australia. 50%, not 15, 50. Huge numbers of things that we used to produce in this country are no longer produced. And instead of doing that, we have begun to depend on the import of things that we used to make ourselves, which we pay for by tacking it onto a slate called the foreign debt. Mini-size Los Angeles going on, as young unemployed people who've been without jobs for 3 or 4 years are just making a life out of taking on the police. You have bigger and bigger deployments of police trying to deal with young people who feel that life has shut them out completely. And if you want to see where the end result of this is, go and have a look at Europe, where they have 13 million people on the dole queue. 13 million. Joined every year by about 2 million school leavers, coming out into a Europe which slams the door right in their faces and says, there is no future for you. We'll take the absolute cream of young people into management, but the rest of you will not have a job. We'll give you subsistence wages in the form of some sort of social services. Keep out of the way. And the implicit message is this is for life. More and more commentators are now saying privately we're not going to get full employment ever again. The impact of technology just on its own is too great. But if I was a young person in that environment, I wouldn't take it. And I'm quite sure you wouldn't at that age, which is the most sensitive age, if you like, the most volatile age that you go through. The time you come out of your school with some little certificate clutched in your hand if you're lucky, wondering if there's a niche somewhere out in society which lets you in to have a normal life, to become married and to raise children, have your own home or whatever it happens to be. And we're now just saying no. You will have a permanent life in a new type. of society, where you live 20 to a house to share your social services. And so the young people have gone mad. They've gone through the cities of Europe. They've torn Amsterdam and Rotterdam apart. They've gone through Paris about 6 times, and Lyon, and Clermont-Ferrand, and cities in Austria, and even Switzerland, which is one of the most stable countries. They've been through cities in the German Ruhr, through Hamburg and Munich, and you get pictures of bigger and bigger groups of frantic children, just in their late teens, striking out at something they can't even articulate because they don't quite know what has happened, except that life says, you're not really wanted. You see pictures of them smashing the windows of the University of the Sorbonne. And now they send the police out to deal with those young people, but they're not the old police. They're not the old sergeant of police that we used to know in our young period. These are a new type of combatant force who go out in armor. And if you actually look at them, they have plastic helmets, and they have visors, and they have specially designed shields on their arms, and behind those shields they have batons that are designed to crumple by maiming without killing. They actually designed the truncheon to do that. And round their belts they have different gases for immobilizing crowds, which you use against your own children in your own nation. And they run into action. They're trained in street warfare. They're trained in battle. They run into action like troops going in against Saddam Hussein. That is the new police that is emerging in Europe. Now, is this what we want for Australian children? In the most exciting country in the world, if we can get the thing straight, because that's what's being offered. So let's go on from there, and we'll have a look at the second part, which is the value system, the Human Rights Commission. The 1985 Bill of Rights, how it is now being implemented, gradually unfolded. There was a great battle when this first came in, and the Australian people said, we do not want a Bill of Rights. Many would remember that. But they then went to sleep again, and so it is gradually coming in piece by piece by piece. The ultimate is to try and get into place, under the authority of the Human Rights Commission, a final Bill of Rights. Even if you haven't got a final document, you bring it in piece by piece by piece. The Human Rights Commission is given a specific administrative power imposed by law to ignore discrimination or breach of human rights, etc., when such discrimination or breach favors minority or particular ethnic groups. In other words, it can pick which cases it will hear and which it will not. It is not all equal before the law. Let's have a look at the inquisitorial powers of the human rights. Now that sounds very emotive, but it is true that the human rights has a number of powers not traditionally given to the courts in a common law system under our traditional Christian view of things. Let's go on and have a look at these. No right of legal representation at compulsory conferences or inquiries before the Human Rights Commission. Now, if somebody puts in a legal complaint against any person in this room that they were kicking their dog or were abusing their child or done something that comes under the Act, the Human Rights Commission can demand that the person who is complained about appears before it at their own expense and without legal representation. And that person is not allowed to know who has made the complaint, so can never confront their accusers. This is right against the principles in Scripture, which insisted there had to be a minimum of 2 witnesses, so that any person accused had the right to defend himself or herself and cross-examine their accusers. That gradually goes out. And the Human Rights Commission can now bring in principles that we've never had before. The Human Rights Commission is not mandatorily accountable to Parliament or the Minister concerning any matter arising in the course of the performance of its function. In other words, we have a court body or an adjudicating body which is not responsible to the Parliament that is the decision-making process. It is responsible ultimately to the United Nations. Incidentally, we've signed a protocol now that in last December that any Australian can appeal to the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations now. And the next step is that the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations can make judgments which are binding upon Australia. So far, we haven't quite made that step. There is no right given to a person or organization about whom a complaint has been made to the Human Rights Commission to know the identity of the complainant or the details of the complaint or the evidence upon which the complaint is based. Right against all the principles of common law. The Human Rights Commission has power to do all things, this is under the Act under which it's been established, all things necessary or convenient to be done for or in connection with the performance of its functions. It can take any action it pleases. The Human Rights Commission can conduct an examination or inquiry in private, and the Act says it is not bound by the rules of evidence. Now, can you imagine that happening? A court which is not bound by the rules of evidence. So that is the second part of the New World Order. There's the economic part, now being implemented in Australia through the Lima Declaration. The second part is the value system, ultimately to culminate in a complete Bill of Rights based on the new religion of humanism, which is set its sights on replacing the value system that we've had in the past, and which already, like the Trojan horse, is half established here in Australia. And this, while it talks about freedom, produces the dead opposite. It produces a controlled society, a society where the government fears the people, or disarms the people, or surveys the people, or collects more and more data on the people, or asks people to inform on each other, all of which is gradually coming in the Whistleblowers Association, or whether it happens to be the collection of data through tax file numbers, and the centralization of that, the sharing of information now between various government departments, the corruption that comes with selling that information to private institutions, although they promise you that this would never happen. And so we've had warnings coming out from those who are concerned about the effect on civil liberties. In a free society, people should scrutinize the government, not the other way around. Geoffrey Walker, incidentally, one of the top constitutional lawyers in Australia, who's just gone to America and is doing a world study now on the AIDS question and the implications of it, who has written warning of the dangers of some of the legislation going with traditional values for the individual and freedom for the individual. Another one. The underhanded theft of Australia's privacy, a report in The Australian. The federal bureaucracy has resolved to bring the populace to heel. Roger Clark, Reader in Information Services, Australian National University. Now, after all the promises made by government ministers that the information taken on each individual would never be shared amongst government departments and would certainly be protected against misuse, we've seen the recent reports where a number of officials are now being charged with selling huge quantities of information to banks or private companies. It is the controlled society where freedom, you get a population in the end that becomes corrupt because it dares not stand for what it believes in. The ultimate form of corruption, if you want to see this, was in Greece, 500 years before the time of Christ, where they had a slave society. They had slaves in each household. And the barbarians came in at one stage and promised to release all the slaves. And when it came to the point, the slaves refused to accept their freedom because they would have had to start making decisions and accepting personal responsibility and fighting for their own rights. And people can become so compliant that nobody wants to rock the boat. Nobody wants to swim against the tide. Nobody really wants to take an unpopular stand. And we can get so compliant and so weak that you can have things that are occurring in broad daylight in our streets, a rape, and people will cross the street and walk by rather than get involved. That is the depths of corruption, the depths of corruption. What does this mean for the Australia of the future? It means that we lose our identity and our decision-making process. The Australian newspaper has just done a series of articles called Creating the Future. I don't know whether you read those, in which they invited economists and experts and futurists and academics to speak on what Australia is going to be like into the next century if the process of globalism, which is simply another word for the same thing, continues. The ABC finally has done a series of reports on the New World Order. This came out over ABC Radio, and they produced a special magazine in February of this year where 6 experts gave their version of the New World Order. Whatever happened to the New World Order? There was such a demand for this that the text of the talks was printed out and was put into a supplement in their monthly magazine. The most interesting, they're all very interesting, but the most interesting was a lady who was one of the top executives inside the United Nations. A brilliant woman. She's worked on commissions and in the Third World and in various training programs, and she is absolutely adamant about what is happening. Her paper was entitled, "Who Gives the Orders in the New World Order?" as you can see up there. And she goes on to make the most devastating comment. This was Susan George. She went on to describe, incidentally, what she saw as really behind this world government. "I feel very much that the undemocratic nature of these institutions will mean that a whole new world order is put into place and that it is an anti-democratic, authoritarian order run by the elites of the rich world on their own behalf." That was the findings of a lady who certainly knows what she's talking about because she's been right through the United Nations. Foreign investors in search of a vision. This was the article about what Australia is going to be like in the future. An uneasy public needs to be helped to a more comfortable accommodation of globalism. In other words, they sell globalism as though it's an answer, but they then go on to describe what it's going to be like when we get there. Whether by accident or design, Australia is already well advanced along the path to globalization of our economy. Our appetite for foreign capital has ensured this even if our policies did not. He goes on. And this is the picture of what Australia will be. There will be no national products or technologies, no national corporations, no national industries. There will no longer be national economies, at least as we have come to accept the concept. Now, if you believe that to be so, and we have no national economy, no national industries, no national products, what happens to those who currently own industries? There will be no national shops, no national factories, no national farms. It will all be part of an international process. And if you accept that there will be no national economy, in the end we also have to accept that we have finally and completely disposed of the Australian Constitution. Because the Australian Constitution is adamant that the decision makers and the owners of Australia are the Australian people. That every person in this room has got a stake in that. Every person, if you like, young and old, is a shareholder in a company called Australia Unlimited, which comes or humbly relies on the blessing of Almighty God. That is to go out, and the new global idea comes in where no Australian has any equity in their own country. Incidentally, that statement went on to point out that we would still live here, but we would have no ownership in the whole participation. So that broadly is the proposition which is now lined up for Australia, and I think is likely to come through between now and the end of the century. So, ladies and gentlemen, for better or worse, that is the picture of where we are now. And I believe that each person has to make a decision as to where they stand in this situation. We're now reaching a point where the idea of national sovereignty is spurned and is regarded as reactionary. The United Nations Association of Australia recently came out to say that world government is the only solution to the problems of mankind. Anybody who disagrees with world government is an anarchist. I've got to confess to being an anarchist, if that's the definition. I've got nothing against cooperating with other countries. I've got nothing against trying to get as many mechanisms going for peace as possible. But I am against the idea that the only possible way that this can be done is to prohibit the Australian people from having any real say in the makeup and the future of their own country, because that's the price we're being asked to pay. How soon will this happen? I don't know. My own belief is it is going to work its way through to some sort of culmination point between now and the end of the century. I don't say this in any prophetic sense at all, simply on the pragmatic evidence of where we are now and how quickly this thing is unfolding. I can tell you this, the Australia that we will be in 10 years' time is going to be totally unlike anything that we've seen now. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, could Australia survive if it had to do it? Just think about that for a moment. Let's look at a hypothetical case. Imagine the whole world dropping beneath the sea tomorrow, except this country. Here we are, 17 million people in a very big island continent, and every export market and every import has disappeared. Our politicians and our economists have got to change their whole way of thinking. They can't play macro or micro or freezing or squeezing or cooling or heating or contracting or expanding, or all that jargon disappears now. So they probably all drop dead of a heart attack, which would be a major plus. And then ordinary people would ask ordinary questions and would emerge out of what is really a form of black magic. Like a housewife looking after her family, or a husband looking after his business. We start asking practical questions. We have 17 million people here, which is nothing. There are 19 million people in Tokyo, 22 million in Mexico City. We've got 17 million people sharing what really is a promised land. Could we live, could we feed ourselves here if we had to do it? And the answer is probably 10 times over. So nobody's got to starve. In that case, why is it in every capital city of Australia and a lot of country areas we have special programs feeding children at school because they're not getting enough to eat at home? Isn't that a disgrace? The program started in Adelaide last time I lectured there because a headmaster found Australian children going through the dustbins in his school grounds to find something to eat. This is Australia, not Ethiopia. Could we clothe ourselves, or are we all going to streak around naked? I once worked out if we had to use our own wool in this country, every Australian from 1 day old to the oldest person would get 68 suits and 127 blankets every 12 months. So we don't have to really go cold. And do you know, there are thousands of Australians can't afford one decent wool blanket in the greatest wool producer the world has ever seen? Could we house ourselves? Imagine a situation where the government policy said to the whole building industry, we want you to stop building any tourist resort hotels, any city office blocks, any new government departments, and put the whole of Australia's building industry to providing every Australian who is homeless with a decent home. How long would it take us to fix it? 3 years? Probably a bit quicker. Have we got enough energy? Petrol, oil, natural gas, it's coming out of our ears. Have we got enough coal? Perhaps we're short of minerals. I once worked out we've got 92 out of 94 minerals known to mankind. There is no other nation that can come near that. We are the most blessed country in the world in physical terms. And we sit in the middle of all this, destroying ourselves, getting into debt, seeing families crippled, governments corrupt. Our nation is becoming a debtor nation. Our young people have very little hope. They take trips now into the subcultures of drugs or crime or whatever because the reality of Australia doesn't seem exciting anymore. And yet we have such a lot going for us that if we can't get it together for the Australians of the future, we don't deserve to keep it. Well, people say, what's going to do it? Do we need a new politician? Heaven forbid. We want a regeneration of the people, and it has got to be based on spiritual principles. If we don't get our spiritual values correct, we might as well forget the rest. There has never been a civilization in the whole of mankind's history, Christian or otherwise, which has not started from some agreement on values, some acknowledgement of what is right and what is wrong. We're producing generations who don't even know that now. And ultimately, we've got to accept that there is a power higher than politicians. Very difficult to get Mr. Keating or Mr. Houston to accept that. There is a far greater power. There is a God. There is a creator. And if we get ourselves into the right position, things change. If we try and go our own way and become laws unto ourselves, we destroy ourselves. Nations which reach the pitch of misery and become humble and penitent and start looking for truth and finding it and getting into harmony with it can get straight again. It is not inevitable that Australia destroys itself. We are at war in a sense. There is a war declared against our value system. We've got to become fighters. We've got to get off the fence. The number of Australians sitting on the fence now is frightening. The fence is wobbling like this. In the end, when the fence collapses, we're going to find ourselves one side or the other. It would be very easy to say, well, look, this is inevitable. Don't fight it. Live for the moment. Let's hope it's going to be all right. But you've got to answer to your children, too. That means that every person in this room tonight is incredibly important. You do count. You can do something. You can speak for the truth. You can stand against something you think is wrong. You can pass information on to your fellows. And if enough of us do that, well, then perhaps we can turn the tide. And we've, above all, got to find at least a minority of people who provide a genuine example in seeking God again and demonstrating that God is there and that God works. And if that can be done, Australia could be one of the most exciting countries in the world. It has more going for it than any other. But we better get started because we haven't got too much time.
If there's one thing the people concerned about the New Order have in common, it is the belief in the imperative of world disarmament, general and complete disarmament. Many publications in the United States have written about this. Not many are in the public domain. There was a very important one around about 1961 issued by the State Department called Freedom from War, which was a blueprint for disarmament. They made the point that not only was disarmament necessary, but in order to maintain a state of disarmament, they wished to establish a sort of universal surveillance system. But this was in the days before the satellite technology was really developed, so they thought in terms and they wrote in terms of monitoring stations which should be established all over the world at all the major highways, railways and aerodromes to maintain surveillance of every nation so that after the nation had been disarmed they couldn't establish an army behind the back of the central authority. The United Nations would get all the weapons and all the atomic weapons and they would be the central controlling force. This is State Department policy of the United States. It's never been rescinded. Their program presented by the Kennedy administration in '61 was almost identical to a Russian proposal which had been presented about 5 years earlier to the United Nations, although from memory that didn't mention the universal surveillance that would be needed. Now, there are a lot of people, a lot of academics who are not seeking political power, who believe that there must be some kind of disarmament. They believe, as Einstein said back in 1946, if you don't have disarmament of nuclear weapons, then you're going to blow yourselves off the planet and that will be the end of humanity. Professor Urey, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry some years ago for an experiment where he was trying to develop life with electricity from basic amino acids, made the point that yes, we need to have disarmament, but he said, watch out, because when you establish a central authority that does the disarming, it's going to be a police state. So we're left with this incredible choice. We either risk random acts of nuclear terrorism or nuclear war at some time in the future, or we submit ourselves to the police state, which is required to maintain the disarmament. It's up to people to work out what the choice should be. In the closing part of the last decade of the 80s, I became aware of a number of enormous computer centres that had been established and were being established in the capital cities in Australia, established under conditions of enormous secrecy. And on my radio program here in Sydney, somebody rang in one night and said, I'm working on a project involving an enormous computer. He said, I've worked on projects with the Department of Defence and with the intelligence authorities in the past, He said, but never have I seen anything with the backups that this system has, nor the size of the project, nor the degree of secrecy that surrounds it. And he said, you're a journalist, can you go and find out about this for me? Well, the minister wouldn't talk. Telecom, under whose auspices these things were being built, wouldn't talk to me. I could not get a spokesman from Telecom on the program to discuss these things. Now, I dealt with this on the program, and pieces of information would come in dribs and drabs. Some journalists tried to get into one of these computer centres and were run off at pistol point. A friend of mine managed to get into one of these buildings before the computers arrived, and he was doing an inspection on behalf of the fire brigade, which was legally necessary. Although they had tried to keep him out, he pressed the point that the fire brigade had to inspect all new buildings to make sure they had the right sprinkler systems and so on. And as he was being taken through this giant building, about 2 acres in area, he asked what it was going to be for. He said it was like an enormous aircraft hangar. And the head of the project that was leading the delegation around said, well, we're going to put a computer in here worth $600 million. Oh, and what are you going to use it for? My friend asked. We're going to print telephone bills, was the reply. Oh, come on now, he said, you know, you print perfectly good bills at the moment. I got one in the mail this morning. You don't need $600 million worth of computer to print telephone bills. And the answer was short and sweet, well, you know you're going to get an ID card, don't you? Was the response, and that's all he would say about it. So, to put the cost of this computer in perspective, Britain's air defence computer is worth about the same amount. And they expect that they won't have the bugs ironed out of that air defence computer until almost the end of the decade, of the 90s. When the tax department a little later put in a computer worth $300 million in Canberra, the Australian newspaper said this is possibly the biggest computer purchase of all time. And it was only half the value of one computer in Sydney, which we know is only one of a number in the network. And we now know they have something to do with the ID card. Well, a little while after I got this information, I received a visit from a person in our intelligence community here in Australia who naturally had to remain anonymous, but I checked his ID to make sure he did come from the intelligence community. He said a number of us are a bit upset that the whole thing seems to be run by the Americans. As in the Vietnam War, we thought we were doing it for Australia. We ended up being pushed around by Uncle Sam. And that is why some of the details of these things would fall off the back of the truck outside the homes of journalists like myself. He said, you're on the right track with these computer centres, but you only know 1% of it. Now, this is, to many academics, a responsible way to manage a planet, and an ID card, which can keep track of people, is part of that system. There are arguments in favour of this. I can understand that. And I said to this person, I can understand that they want to keep it secret because it may not be a popular idea at first. I can understand they would spend a lot of money on this, but I couldn't understand the reason for the hurry. They were building these computer centres at triple time. They were working 24 hours a day to get them up and running by the late 80s. What's the reason for the hurry? And he said simply, because they're preparing for war. Now, I tried to get the details from him as to what war they were preparing for, and he wasn't specific. He didn't indicate that it wasn't going to be war between Russia and America. That was never really a risk. People who can't build a TV set that works were really no threat to the United States. He felt it was possibly war involving at least one Asian nation, and that Australia would be on the periphery of it. And it gradually sunk in that what they were doing was preparing Australia as a kind of a bunker, a safe place where the VIPs from the Northern Hemisphere, specifically the United States, could come and ride out the storm if there were some kind of war in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, war's not the only risk. If you have a few more Chernobyl meltdowns, you put the food chain in the Northern Hemisphere at risk, because when there is a meltdown like Chernobyl, and there have been 2 so far, and there are 15 similar reactors waiting to go, and incidentally they're about to start up Chernobyl again because they need the power, so there's a risk of more radioactivity escaping, then all around the world at that latitude, you run the risk of the fallout putting radioactivity into the food supply, into the food chain.
Implicit in the idea of a new world order is the introduction of a universal value system, or a one-world religion. History testifies that the government and social order of a civilization has always been determined by its religious and moral values. Given the multiplicity of faiths around the world, Can the New World Order ever hope to bring them all under one faith?
The short answer to that question is they cannot possibly do that, although it is believed that the way to do it is to obliterate all faiths that conflict with the idea of a world government and a universal value system. So there are religious connotations, quite obviously, to the idea of a new world order. The only way you can achieve it is to produce universal agreement on the values that are going to be incorporated, because values spill over into government and law. Islamic law is different from Christian law. To try and say that your faith is different from the way society is going to be run is simply not true. That the two are connected. Now, the only way you could ever produce a world order is to produce a one-world faith, and there is a lot of talk about a synthesis of all faiths into a universal faith. And we have what is called the syncretic movement, in which interfaith services are now held with increasing frequency, and you might find services in some of the cathedrals where the worship is shared by Buddhists, or the Islamic faith, where you might get an Islamic preacher and then a Jewish rabbi and a Christian prelate, all trying to find some common ground, although the fundamentals of their faith are in conflict. And the ultimate of this is to try and produce a sort of New Age faith, and that's where there is a spillover into the New Age movement. But in real terms, the Islamic people are the strongest of all the faiths in their opposition to the New World Order. And we've got to remember that the Islamic community is much wider than our perceptions, which are it is a Middle East faith. The Islamic faith stretches from West Africa, Nigeria, in a huge crescent that goes right through Egypt, right through the Middle East, right down through countries like India and Burma, and spilling over into China itself in some areas, and then down to the biggest Islamic nation in the world, which is Indonesia, just north of us. And they are growing now in their unity, incidentally spilling over into the southern part of the Soviet Union, where a large number of those newly emergent republics are Islamic. Now, in the Islamic world, the new feature is what is called fundamentalism. Let's go back to the roots of our faith and reject any compromise with other faiths. So fundamentalism, as expressed by the Ayatollah Khomeini or some of the other leaders, is a major factor that perceives itself to be at war with the West and to be at war with the New World Order. And some of the strongest stuff in opposition to the New World Order is coming from the Islamic side of things. So we're going to see not a world brought together in peace or harmony at all, but a world which is now increasing and exacerbating the divisions between men. It's going to be a world of anarchy and chaos. I think we've got to be careful in the way we talk about this, because there are many people in the New Age movement who have gone there because the major religions have tended to fail them. And this is one of the tragedies of the Western world, that its own faith, which built their communities and built their nations and their ideals, has abdicated a lot of responsibility for the social order. So people are seeking for some new meaning, and there are elements of truth in the New Age movement. But at its pinnacle, the New Age movement ultimately is a new world order faith, and presents a lot of danger, a tremendous amount of danger. It is linked into the idea that there is no personal God, there is no supernatural creator, but that God is within you. It sometimes spills over into pantheism, that nature itself is God rather than being the creation of God himself, or that the human being can simply tap into his own inner resources and find in there a type of self-worship that replaces true worship. And therefore it is a delusion in many cases. I think everything about the idea of a one-world government is artificial, it is against truth, it is totalitarian and must be, it is undemocratic, it places more value on systems than the components of systems, which are ordinary human beings. It is scathing about, in real terms, about the value of human life. And it ultimately is the concept of an elite who see themselves as superior to others and must have the power to produce the sort of world that they want. Therefore, I believe it is an attempt by man to do what is the greatest temptation of all, to become a god in which you want to impose your ideas on others. And it is doomed to failure. When I don't believe we're going to see it. We might see a short attempt to try and impose some type of order on people, but already the chaos that is being produced, the bow wave of this New World Order movement is so great that it's threatening to engulf the very ship that's pushing it along. What happened in the Soviet has set it back a long way. What is now happening in the tremendous growth of concern about the directions we're taking is growing stronger the whole time, which means that we're, I believe, moving to a period of anarchy and breakdown in which a seedbed for the reemergence of truth is possible. And if that happens, it will not happen in an organized way at all. It will happen in little areas as people begin to develop true faith and a proper faith in God and a proper relationship with God, and perhaps just get their local village or their community or their family straight and then build from there. In other words, it's an organic growth from small units, from small seed, that truth really establishes itself. It's never imposed over the top of humanity by some sort of man-made structure, and never will be.